Memoirs and Reflections is the famous memoirs of Marshal Zhukov, which became one of the most discussed military works in the history of Soviet literature. The original version of the text was published only in 1990, when researchers turned to the original manuscript in the State Military Archive. The history of the memoirs publication reflects the difficult era of Soviet censorship. Despite the fact that the first edition was published during the Soviet era, Zhukov dared to include critical remarks about Stalin. However, the censors significantly interfered with the content. References to repression in the army and critical assessments of the country's leadership were removed. A special case is connected with the appearance of references to Brezhnev in the memoirs. According to contemporaries, the text included episodes about the alleged meeting of the Marshal with the future Secretary General on the Little Earth, although in reality they did not intersect during the war. Zhukov's attitude to these edits was philosophical. He believed that a thinking reader would figure out the situation on his own. In the last years of his life, Marshal spoke bitterly about the fate of his memoirs, warning that due to numerous censorship edits, the text differs significantly from its original idea. It was only years later that readers had the opportunity to get acquainted with the true memories of the great commander. Analyzing Marshal Zhukov's memoirs and public appearances, one can note the sequence of his assessment of Stalin's personality. A typical example is his speech at the plenum of the Central Committee of the CPSU in 1956, where his judgments echo what was described in the book Memories and Reflections. In Zhukov's estimation, Stalin appears as an outstanding statesman and a talented organizer. The Marshal emphasized the leader's ability to effectively lead the country at the most critical moments. An illustrative example was Stalin's behavior during the battle for Moscow. Even when German troops were only 30 kilometers from the capital, the Supreme Commander continued to firmly fulfill his duties at headquarters. Zhukov strongly opposed attempts to belittle Stalin's military credentials. In particular, he refuted the widespread claim under Khrushchev that Stalin allegedly planned military operations on the globe. According to the Marshal, although the Supreme was not engaged in tactical maps, he was well versed in the operational situation and strategic maps. In describing Stalin, Zhukov noted his natural talents, a sharp mind, developed intuition, exceptional memory, and extensive knowledge in various fields. However, along with the advantages, the Marshal did not ignore the significant shortcomings in the activities of the Supreme Commander, subjecting them to reasonable criticism. In his memoirs, Marshal Zhukov gives an unequivocal assessment of Stalin's military talents. Can Stalin be considered an outstanding military leader? Of course not, says the commander, noting that such an image was artificially created to please the leader himself. Zhukov mentions a typical example: the story spread by Stalin about how Lenin, recognizing himself too old to study military science, insisted on the deep development of military science by young workers of the Central Committee, and especially Stalin. As a direct participant in the events, who went through the entire war side by side with Stalin, Zhukov had the opportunity to thoroughly evaluate his military abilities. According to the Marshal, in the first 2 years of the war, the Supreme Commander demonstrated a weak understanding of military strategy and an even more superficial knowledge of the art of operations. Gaps in the understanding of the organization of operations at the level of fronts and armies were especially obvious. Despite his lack of competence, Stalin, from the beginning of hostilities, sought to actively demonstrate his operational and strategic skills, relying mainly on the experience of the Civil War. Zhukov notes that such attempts rarely led to positive results. It is noteworthy that a similar situation was observed in the top leadership of Nazi Germany. Leading German military leaders, such as Manstein and Guderian, unanimously criticized Hitler's military decisions, describing his operations as illogical and ineffective. In his assessments of the USSR's preparations for war, Zhukov points to a serious discrepancy between propaganda, rhetoric, and the real state of affairs. The country's leadership, and especially Stalin, were preparing for a completely different scenario of military action, a short-term, triumphant campaign that was to unfold on enemy territory. This approach was reflected in a well-known slogan of the time: "The enemy will be beaten with little blood on someone else's territory." State propaganda actively cultivated the image of the invincible Soviet military machine, constantly emphasizing the Army's ability to deliver a crushing triple blow in response to any aggression. Such rhetoric created a dangerous illusion in society of an easy victory in the upcoming conflict. Such self-confident statements, as the Marshal notes, had little to do with the actual state of the country's armed forces and defense capability on the eve of the war. In his memoirs, Zhukov analyzes in detail the critical situation with the military leadership on the eve of the war. In the period 1937 to 1939, the Army experienced a large-scale rotation of command staff at all levels, from military district commanders to regimental and division commanders. The reason for these changes was the massive repression against military leaders. The new cadres who replaced the repressed commanders often did not have sufficient qualifications for their positions. The problem of incompetence was particularly acute at the command level of the fronts and armies. Stalin's chronic suspicion of military specialists caused serious damage to the Army's combat capability. The introduction of the Institute of Military Commissars created an atmosphere of distrust toward the commanding staff, which negatively affected military discipline and commanders' confidence in their own decisions. Zhukov's position on the outbreak of war deserves special attention. The Marshal categorically disagrees with the thesis about the suddenness of the German invasion. In his opinion, the German attack, although it was a treacherous violation of the non-aggression pact, was a completely predictable event. Zhukov argues that the concept of a surprise attack was created by Stalin after the fact to justify his own miscalculations in preparing the country for defense. The leader stubbornly ignored the numerous intelligence reports about the impending invasion, considering them provocative. According to Marshal Zhukov, Stalin consistently rejected all incoming intelligence about Germany's preparations for an attack. As a result, the Soviet troops met the invasion in a state of peacetime, unprepared to repel a massive enemy strike. Although the situation required immediate action, putting units on alert, deploying them, and setting specific tasks to repel possible aggression, Stalin refrained from taking drastic measures for fear of provoking the Germans to war. An illustrative example of this position was the events in the early morning of June 22nd. When Zhukov woke Stalin up at 3:25 a.m. with a telephone message about the beginning of the German invasion, Stalin refused to acknowledge the reality of what was happening, continuing to insist that it was just a provocation. Surprisingly, even after arriving at the Central Committee building at dawn and receiving additional confirmation of the outbreak of hostilities, Stalin continued to adhere to his version of the provocative nature of what was happening. In his memoirs, Zhukov pays special attention to the problem of unjustified human losses caused by Stalin's decisions. The Supreme Commander regularly set unrealistic deadlines for the preparation and conduct of military operations. As a result, the fighting began without proper preparation, with insufficient material support, which inevitably led to significant human casualties. A characteristic feature of the Stalinist leadership style, according to the Marshal, was a disdainful attitude towards the preservation of personnel. In moments of irritation, the leader insisted on the immediate deployment of unprepared, poorly trained units. When the military leaders tried to object, pointing out that the premature use of untrained units would lead to unjustified losses, Stalin abruptly ended the discussion with the words, "There's nothing to whine about. That's what the war is about." Zhukov is convinced that the nature of the war could have been completely different if Soviet troops in the western border districts had been put on full alert in a timely manner. With proper defense construction and clearly defined tasks to repel an enemy attack, military operations could develop according to a much more favorable scenario for the USSR.